The sound that woke me was not a gentle one. It was the angry, metallic scream of a two-stroke engine, a sound that has no place in the quiet hours of a suburban morning. I looked at the clock on my nightstand. The red digits glowed. 6:42 a.m. For a moment I lay there under the weight of my quilt, trying to place the noise. It was too close to be roadwork, too aggressive for a neighbor's lawnmower. It was a chainsaw, and it was in my yard. I swung my legs out of bed, the floorboards cool against the soles of my feet. I didn't rush. Rushing has never been my nature. My wife Martha, before she passed, used to say I moved with the speed of geologic time. I pulled on a pair of jeans and a gray sweatshirt, the one with the faded emblem of the State Forestry Service on the breast. I walked to the kitchen, the whine of the saw growing louder, punctuated by the dull, sickening thud of wood being bitten into. I started the coffee maker, the gurgling sound a small, domestic protest against the violence outside. As the dark liquid filled the carafe, I stood at the kitchen window, looking out over the back lawn. And there she was, Carol Peterson, president of the Chestnut Lane Homeowners Association, standing with her arms crossed, a vision in pristine white tennis shorts and a pastel pink polo shirt. She stood in a posture of supreme command, like a general overseeing a siege. Beside her were two men I didn't recognize, clad in orange vests, one of them holding the shrieking saw to the base of my oak tree. My oak tree. It was a bur oak, Quercus macrocarpa, over 100 years old. Its trunk was as wide as a dining table, its gnarled branches a complex cathedral against the morning sky. It had been a sapling when this neighborhood was just a field, a mature tree when my parents bought this house, and a silent giant that had shaded my entire life. I poured coffee into a thick ceramic mug, the one Martha had given me for my 50th birthday. It felt solid in my hand. I opened the back door and stepped onto the patio. The air was thick with the smell of sawdust and exhaust fumes. Carol's head snapped in my direction, a triumphant smirk playing on her lips. The man with the saw powered it down, and the sudden silence was more jarring than the noise had been. "Arthur," she said, her voice carrying across the dew-wet grass, with a practiced, condescending clarity. "Good, you're awake. We were trying to get this done before it disturbed anyone." I took a slow sip of my coffee. It was hot, black, and bitter. "Carol," I said, my voice quiet. "What are you doing?" "It's coming down," she announced, gesturing to the deep, fresh cut in the trunk of the oak. It was a grievous wound, bleeding sap. The board had a special vote. It's a unanimous decision. The tree is a hazard. It's blocking the sightlines from the new community gazebo. I looked past her, toward the far end of the common area that bordered my property. The gazebo, a flimsy white vinyl structure, had been her pet project for the last year. It sat 100 yards away. The idea that my oak, which stood entirely on my property, was blocking a sight line from that glorified bird cage was patently absurd. "You are on my property, Carol," I said, keeping my tone perfectly level. "And you are instructing these men to destroy my property. You need to leave. Now." She laughed. It was a short, sharp, dismissive sound. "Oh, Arthur, always so dramatic. Don't you read the HOA newsletter? We sent out a notice. This is for the good of the community. Your personal attachment to this overgrown weed doesn't supersede the board's authority. Besides," she added, her eyes narrowing, "there's a 5-foot utility and access easement along all property lines. We are well within our rights. If you try to interfere, I'll have the sheriff here in 5 minutes, and you'll be fined for obstruction, $1,000 per day." I took another sip of coffee. I looked from her smug, confident face to the two workers, who were now looking back and forth between us, a flicker of uncertainty in their eyes. I looked at the deep gash in the bark of my ancient tree. I thought of the countless hours I had spent under its branches, the tire swing that had hung there when I was a boy, the way the late afternoon sun filtered through its leaves. And then I looked back at her. She had no idea. She had no idea who I was, what I did for a living, or the nature of the beast she had just prodded with a very, very sharp stick. She saw a quiet, retired old man who kept to himself. A widower who was an easy mark. She had no idea she had just declared war on the state's foremost expert on trees and the laws that protect them. But before I tell you what I did next, I should probably explain. This wasn't the beginning. This was the culmination of a long, slow-burning fire that Carol had been stoking for years, and all that time, I had been quietly, methodically, keeping the receipts. I am, or was, the state forester for this region. It's not a title many people understand. They think it means I'm a park ranger, or that I fight forest fires. I've done a bit of that, but my actual job for the last 35 years was far more bureaucratic, far more rooted in paper than in soil. I dealt with land use law, conservation easements, riparian rights, timber contracts, and, most pertinently, the State Heritage Tree Program. My work was a complex tapestry of biology, ecology, and the cold, hard letter of the law. I spent my days reading dense legal documents, poring over topographical maps and aerial surveys, and writing reports that could stop a multi-million-dollar development in its tracks. My colleagues called me the archivist. I took it as a compliment. I believed that a problem properly documented was a problem already solved. When Martha died 5 years ago, the house became very quiet. The work, which had been a passion, became a refuge. I retired 2 years later, not because I wanted to stop working, but because the silence of the office had started to sound too much like the silence at home. I wanted to be in the garden she had loved, to sit under the oak tree we had both cherished. I wanted peace. I wanted order. Carol Peterson moved into the neighborhood about a year after Martha's passing. She bought the big colonial on the corner. Within 6 months, she had campaigned for and won the presidency of the HOA. Her platform was restoring community values and property values. It sounded harmless enough. Her methods, however, were anything but. Carol was a performative tyrant. She wielded the HOA's book of covenants and restrictions like a holy text, interpreting its vague passages to suit her whims. Her reign began with small things. She mandated a specific shade of beige for all mailboxes, issuing fines to anyone whose paint was a shade too dark or too light. She measured the height of lawn gnomes and decorative flamingos, citing a rule about non-permanent lawn fixtures, not exceeding 18 inches. Mr. Henderson, 3 doors down, was fined $200 because his son's portable basketball hoop was left at the end of his driveway overnight. The rulebook said nothing about basketball hoops. Carol simply declared it fell under the category of unsightly clutter. Most people just paid the fines. It was easier. Arguing with Carol was like arguing with a hurricane. She would puff herself up, quote, non-existent bylaws, threaten liens and lawyers, and create such a public spectacle that most people would retreat, writing a check just to make her go away. They were afraid of her. They were tired. I was not afraid. I was an observer, and I was a documentarian. The first fine I received was for the state of my bird feeder. According to Carol, who delivered the notice personally, it was attracting an undesirable element of fauna, squirrels specifically. The fine was $50. I read the notice. I read the section of the covenants she cited, which spoke vaguely of nuisance animals. I then went to my desk, wrote a check for $50, made a photocopy of the check and the notice, and placed them in a new manila folder. On the tab, I wrote in neat block letters, Peterson, C. HOA. I kept the receipts, every single one. When the newsletter came out announcing the mandatory replacement of all front porch light fixtures with a specific, overpriced model from a catalog she recommended, I printed the newsletter. I bought the new fixture. I kept the receipt for the fixture and I put it in the folder. When she sent a community-wide email admonishing residents for leaving their garbage cans visible from the street for more than 3 hours after pickup, I printed the email and put it in the folder. The folder grew thick with these records of petty despotism. It wasn't about the money, and it was about the principle. It was about the paper trail. On paper, her actions were a clear pattern of overreach and harassment. On paper, she was building her own cage. The issue of the oak tree had started subtly, about 6 months before the incident with the chainsaw. It began with the gazebo. Carol had railroaded the project through the board, claiming it would be a focal point for community gathering. What it really was a monument to her own perceived importance. Once it was built, she began her campaign against the tree. It started with a polite-seeming email. "Dear Arthur," it read, "I hope you are well. Now that our beautiful new gazebo is complete, we are looking at ways to enhance the views from it. Your large oak tree, while lovely, does create a significant shadow over the common area and obstructs the view of the sunset. We would like to discuss the possibility of having it professionally trimmed. The HOA will, of course, cover the cost." I replied simply, "Dear Carol, thank you for your offer. The tree is healthy and I am not interested in having it trimmed at this time. It stands entirely on my private property. Regards, Arthur." I printed both emails and put them in the folder. A month later, a certified letter arrived. It was more formal. It stated that the board of directors had determined the tree constituted a nuisance under Article 4, Section 2 of the Covenants, due to excessive leaf shedding into the common area. It demanded that I have the tree aggressively pruned within 30 days, or the HOA would hire a contractor to do so at my expense. This was a significant escalation. It was a direct threat. So I began to work the problem my way. I went back to my desk and got to work. I pulled out my original property deed and the official plat map I had filed with the county when I bought the house 40 years ago. The plat map is the master document, the legally binding drawing that shows the exact dimensions of every lot, every easement, every boundary line. My property line was clearly marked. The oak tree stood a good 20 feet inside it. Then I looked for the easement she had mentioned. There was indeed a 5-foot utility easement along the back of my property. An easement is a legal right for someone else to use a portion of your property for a specific purpose. This one was standard, granted to the power and water companies for maintaining their lines. It said nothing about access for the HOA. It certainly said nothing about improving Sightlines. Her interpretation was a fantasy. I drafted a response. It was polite, professional, and utterly uncompromising. I cited the plat map by its official filing number at the county records office. I quoted the specific language of the utility easement, explaining that it did not grant the HOA any rights whatsoever. I attached a copy of my deed. I stated, unequivocally, that the tree was on my private property, and that any attempt by her or any agent of the HOA to enter my property, to trim or remove the tree, would be considered trespassing and destruction of property. I sent the letter via certified mail, with a signature required. The return receipt, bearing Carol's looping, arrogant signature, went right into the folder. She had no idea that this letter was not an argument. It was a legal foundation. It was me, on paper, establishing the facts and warning her of the consequences. Her signature was proof that she had received this warning. I knew she would ignore it. People like Carol believe that rules are for other people. They believe that paper can be overcome with sheer force of will. And so, we arrived at the morning of the chainsaw. Standing on my patio, mug in hand, I was not angry. I was, in a strange way, disappointed. I had given her the off-ramp. I had laid out the facts in black and white, and she had driven right past it, accelerating toward a cliff she couldn't even see. $1,000 a day, she repeated, her voice laced with smug satisfaction. "And we'll be putting a lien on your house for the cost of the tree removal. The crew estimates it'll be about $5,000. You should have just agreed to the trimming, Arthur." I took one last sip of my coffee and set the mug down on the patio table. I pulled my phone from my pocket. I did not dial 911. I opened the camera and started recording. For the record, I said, my voice calm and clear, my phone pointed directly at her. My name is Arthur Penhaligon. It is 6:51 a.m. on Tuesday, June 14th. You are Carol Peterson, president of the Chestnut Lane Homeowners Association. You are standing on my property at 14 Chestnut Lane, along with two unidentified individuals you have hired. You have, without my consent, begun to cut down a 100-year-old bur oak, which is my private property. You have just threatened me with a $1,000 fine for obstruction and a $5,000 lien for the cost of this illegal act. Is all of that correct? The color drained from her face. Her performance faltered. The confident smirk was gone, replaced by a flicker of confusion and anger. This was not in her script. The two workers looked at each other, then at the deep cut in the tree. One of them, the one who wasn't holding the saw, took a half step back. "What do you think you're doing?" she stammered, recovering slightly. "You can't record me. That's illegal." It is not illegal to record a conversation in a public-facing space where there is no reasonable expectation of privacy, especially when a crime is in progress, I stated flatly. It was a line I had heard lawyers use 100 times. Now, for the second time, I am ordering you and your contractors to leave my property immediately. The man who had backed away now spoke up. "Ma'am," he said, his voice nervous. "Maybe we should wait. If this is his property." "It's not," Carol shrieked, her composure shattering. "It's in the easement. Do what I told you to do. Cut it down." The man with the saw looked at her, then at my phone, then at the ground. He shook his head. "No, ma'am, not until this is sorted out. We're not getting our company sued." He set the chainsaw down on the grass. Carol's face turned a shade of crimson that clashed violently with her pink polo shirt. She was sputtering, speechless with rage. She had lost control of the scene. Her authority, which was built entirely on bluff and bluster, had evaporated the moment it was met with documented reality. "You will regret this, Arthur," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "You have no idea who you're messing with. I will ruin you. I will own this house." She turned on her heel and stormed off across the lawn, stabbing at her own phone with a manicured finger. The two workers, looking profoundly relieved, gathered their equipment and followed her at a distance, practically running to their truck. I stopped recording. I saved the video. I walked over to the oak. The gash was deep, a pale, wet smile in the dark, furrowed bark. It reached nearly a third of the way through the massive trunk. I ran my hand over the wound. The tree was grievously injured, but it was still standing. She had failed, and in doing so, she had given me everything I needed. She had no idea that in trying to destroy my tree, she had just handed me the axe to chop down her entire rotten kingdom. She had no idea she just buried the only thing keeping her street dry. I went back inside, rinsed out my coffee mug, and placed it in the dishwasher. Then I went to my office, sat down at my desk, and got to work. My first call was not to a lawyer. It was to my old office. "David," I said when my former protege picked up the phone. "It's Arthur. I need a favor. I need you to pull up the state's GIS data for my address and cross-reference it with the Heritage Tree Registry. I have a file number for you. The first phase of any conflict is information gathering." Carol operated on assumptions and desires. I operated on data. The phone call to David was the opening move in a game she didn't even know she was playing, while she was likely fuming, plotting her next social or financial attack. I was laying a foundation of cold, hard, verifiable facts. David was a good man, sharp and efficient. He had taken over many of my duties when I retired. "Arthur, good to hear your voice. Everything all right?" he asked, a note of concern in his tone. I rarely called. "Everything is proceeding according to a predictable if unpleasant pattern," I said. "I'll explain later. For now, I just need the data. 14 Chestnut Lane, and the registry file is HTR-04-7B-921. "Got it," he said. I could hear the clatter of his keyboard in the background. "Give me a few minutes. I'll email you the official overlays and the registry certificate." While I waited, I began assembling my own file. Not the folder of petty grievances, but a new, more formidable collection. I called it the Oak File. I printed a high-quality still from the video I had taken, showing Carol with her arms crossed, directing the workers. I printed a close-up of the gash in the tree. I printed the emails we had exchanged. I pulled the certified mail receipt with her signature from the Pedersen folder and added it to the new stack. Each document was a brick in the wall I was building around her. The email from David arrived 10 minutes later. It contained 3 attachments. The first was a high-resolution aerial photograph of my neighborhood. Superimposed over it were the official county property lines, rendered in sharp red. The image was unequivocal. The base of my oak tree was 22 feet inside my property line. The 5-foot utility easement was a thin, green line, far behind it. The second attachment was a PDF of the official plat map, the same one I had in my files, but this one was certified by the county clerk's office, bearing a digital seal and timestamp from that very morning. It was irrefutable. The third attachment was the bombshell. It was a scanned copy of a certificate from the State Heritage Tree Registry, dated April 12, 1984. It officially designated the Burr Oak at 14 Chestnut Lane, identified by its GPS coordinates and a brass plaque number, which I knew was still embedded in the bark on the far side of the trunk, as a tree of significant historical and ecological value to the state. The designation had been granted based on a petition from the town's historical society, citing the tree's age and its status as a local landmark. Under state law, a registered heritage tree was afforded special protections. It was illegal to remove, destroy, or cause irreparable harm to such a tree without a state-issued permit, which required a compelling public safety reason, an arborist's report, a public hearing, and the approval of the state forester. My approval. The penalty for violating this statute was not a civil fine from an HOA. It was a criminal misdemeanor, carrying a penalty of up to $10,000 and a potential jail sentence. Carol Petersen, in her blind arrogance, had not just trespassed. She had not just attempted to destroy my property. She had, with witnesses, attempted to commit a crime against the state. I kept the receipts. This one was the most valuable of all. I printed the certificate on heavy cardstock. I printed the relevant section of the State Environmental Code. I placed them reverently on top of the growing stack in the Oak File. My next step was to formalize my position. I sat down and composed an email to the entire HOA board, of which Carol was president. The other members were Brenda, the treasurer, a quiet woman who seemed perpetually intimidated by Carol, and 2 of Carol's cronies, Mark and Steve, who rubber-stamped her every decision. The email was a masterpiece of professional detachment. The subject line was, "Formal notice of illegal action and trespass at 14 Chestnut Lane." I detailed the events of the morning, citing the exact time. I stated that agents hired by the HOA, under the direct supervision of President Carol Petersen, had illegally entered my property and attempted to destroy a significant asset. I attached the video file. I attached the certified plat map. I informed them that their claim of an access easement was factually incorrect and legally baseless. I concluded by stating that I expected a formal apology, a written assurance that no such action would ever be repeated, and full financial responsibility for an assessment of the damage by a certified arborist of my choosing. I gave them 48 hours to respond. I sent it with delivery and read receipts enabled. I knew Carol would intercept it. I knew she would try to control the narrative. But the email was not for her. It was for Brenda. It was for the paper trail. It was to put the entire board on formal notice. From this moment forward, any action they took would be with full knowledge of the facts. Their ignorance could no longer be a defense. The rest of the day was quiet. I saw Carol's car come and go. I imagined the furious phone calls she was making, the story she was spinning to her allies. I spent the afternoon in the yard, I carefully cleaned the wound on the oak, applying a sterile dressing and a sealant as best I could. It was a cosmetic fix, mostly. The real damage was internal. I watered the roots, speaking to the tree as I often did, apologizing for the violation. It felt like tending to a wounded friend. The call came the next morning. It was not from Carol. It was from the sheriff's department. Mr. Arthur Penhaligon. The deputy's voice was young and professional. This is Deputy Evans. We've received a complaint from a Mr. Carol Peterson regarding a boundary dispute and harassment. We need to send a car out to speak with you and get your side of the story. Mr. Carol Peterson? I asked, a small smile touching my lips for the first time in 2 days. Yes, sir. That's what it says here? Oh, wait. My apologies. A Ms. Carol Peterson. Of course, I said. I'll be here all day. So she had called them. This was her next move. She was attempting to use the authority of law enforcement to validate her false narrative. It was a classic tactic of the performative tyrant. Co-opt official power to intimidate your victim. She was framing me as the harasser. An hour later, a patrol car pulled up to my curb. Deputy Evans was young, with a crisp uniform and a serious expression. As he walked up my driveway, I saw Carol emerge from her house, striding across her perfect lawn toward us. She had dressed for the occasion in a businesslike navy blazer, her face a mask of worried concern. The performance had begun. "Deputy, thank you so much for coming," she said, intercepting him before he reached my door. "I'm Carol Peterson, the HOA president. I'm the one who called." "It's this man," she said, pointing at me as I stood calmly in my doorway. "He's become increasingly belligerent. We were attempting to perform necessary community maintenance yesterday, and he became threatening, filming me, making accusations. I'm honestly a little afraid." Deputy Evans looked from her earnest, pleading face to my calm, 60-something-year-old one. I was wearing my gray sweatshirt and holding a copy of the morning paper. I did not look like a belligerent threat. "Ma'am, if you could just give me a moment to speak with Mr. Penhaligon," the deputy said, his tone neutral. He walked past her and up to my porch. "Sir, could you tell me what happened yesterday morning?" I did not invite him in. I stood in the doorway. A front porch is a legal gray area, and I wanted our entire interaction to be as public as possible. Carol was hovering just at the edge of my property line, arms crossed, watching and listening. "Certainly, deputy," I said. At approximately 6:42 a.m. yesterday, Mr. Peterson hired 2 men to come onto my private property and cut down my 100-year-old oak tree. I used her own phrasing, a petty but satisfying jab. I have video of the incident. I also have a copy of the certified county plat map for my property, which clearly shows the tree is well within my boundary lines. I also have a copy of a formal notice I sent to her and the HOA board yesterday, warning them against this exact action. Would you like to see them? I did not raise my voice. I did not show emotion. I simply stated facts and offered evidence. This is a language that law enforcement, buried under an avalanche of hysterical, he said, she said disputes, understands very well. The deputy's eyes flickered toward Carol. Her mask of concern had been replaced with a scowl. "That's a lie," she snapped. "There's an easement. He's twisting the facts." "Sir, I'd like to see the documents you mentioned," Deputy Evans said, ignoring her. I had them ready, of course, in a neat folder. I handed him the plat map first. He studied it for a long moment. He was a young man, but he knew how to read a map. He looked from the paper to the tree, to the property stakes I had installed years ago, which were still visible. "And the video?" he asked. I played it for him on my phone. He watched the whole thing, his expression unreadable. He saw her directing the workers. He heard her threats of fines and liens. He heard my calm, clear request for them to leave. He heard her shriek, "Cut it down." When it was over, he handed the phone back to me. He took out his notepad. "Sir, for the record, what is your full name and date of birth?" I provided them. "And you are stating that she, Carol Peterson, trespassed on your property and directed a third party to damage your tree." "That is correct," I said. I am also stating that she is now filing a false police report against me in an attempt to harass and intimidate me. I would like that noted in your report as well." The deputy's pen scratched across the paper. He turned to Carol, who was now vibrating with barely suppressed fury. "Ma'am," he said, his voice now a shade colder. "This appears to be a civil matter regarding a property dispute. It is not a criminal harassment issue. Based on the documentation Mr. Penhaligon has provided, you were on his property without his permission. I would strongly advise you and any agents of the HOA to stay off his property from now on. If you continue to enter his land, it could be considered criminal trespass." The blood drained from Carol's face. The officer of the law, the authority she had summoned to smite her enemy, had just publicly sided with me. Her weapon had been turned against her. "But the easement," she sputtered. "The bylaws, he's a threat. Ma'am, the documents determine the property line," the deputy said, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Your HOA bylaws do not supersede county records or state law. This is a civil dispute. You need to take it up with a lawyer, not the sheriff's department. Do you understand?" She understood. She stood there, mouth agape, her performance utterly deflated. The deputy gave her a hard look, then turned back to me. "Thank you for your time, sir. We'll file a report." He gave me a slight nod, a gesture of professional respect, and walked back to his car. Carol stood frozen for a long moment, watching him drive away. Then she turned her gaze on me. It was not a look of anger anymore. It was a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. She had been publicly humiliated, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that this would only make her more desperate, and therefore more dangerous. I went back inside. The report filed by Deputy Evans, which I would request a copy of, was another brick in the wall. Another page for the oak file. The next 48 hours were a flurry of activity, not from me, but from the community around me. The deputy's visit had been a public event. Neighbors who had been watching from their windows had seen the exchange. They had seen Carol, the invincible tyrant, be put in her place by a calm man with a folder of papers. The spell of fear was beginning to break. That evening I got a knock on my door. It was Mr. Henderson, the man whose son's basketball hoop had cost him $200. He was a small, nervous man who usually avoided eye contact. Tonight, he looked me straight in the eye. "Mr. Penhaligon," he said, twisting a crumpled baseball cap in his hands. "I saw what happened with the deputy. A few of us are glad you're standing up to her." "I'm just protecting my property, George," I said. "It's more than that," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "She's a bully. Has been for years. We've all been too scared to do anything. But I might have something that can help you." He handed me a thin stack of papers, stapled together. "These are the minutes from the HOA meeting 3 years ago, before Mark and Steve got on the board. It was me and Brenda and another fellow, Tom, who moved away. Carol proposed an amendment to the bylaws to give the board discretionary power to remove any tree on any property that interfered with common area aesthetics. We voted it down, 2-1. It never passed, but she's been acting like it did ever since." I took the papers from him. My heart beat a little faster. This was gold. This was a record of her attempting to gain the very power she was now claiming to have, and failing. It proved she knew she didn't have that authority. It demonstrated intent. "She keeps the official records, of course," Henderson continued. "I'm sure this page is missing from the official binder, but I was the secretary back then. I always kept my own copies." "George," I said, my voice filled with a genuine warmth, "this is invaluable. Thank you." "Thank you, Arthur," he said, a small, defiant smile on his face. "Give her hell." I photocopied the minutes and placed the copy in the oak file. The fearful ally had just delivered a key piece of the puzzle. The coalition was beginning to form. The next day I received an email. It was from an anonymous, newly created address. The subject line was simply HOA Finances. The body of the email contained a single attachment, a spreadsheet. I opened it. It was a detailed breakdown of the HOA's budget for the last 2 years. There were highlighted lines showing payments to a landscaping company called Prestige Horticultural Designs. The payments were substantial, far more than simple lawn mowing would cost. Then, there were lines showing payments for the gazebo, which were almost double the initial estimate approved by the community. And at the bottom there was a note: Prestige Horticultural Designs is owned by Carol's brother-in-law. The overage on the gazebo was paid to a contractor who did work on Carol's private residence last summer. Check the dates. A friend. It had to be Brenda, the treasurer, the disillusioned insider. She had access to the books, and her conscience had finally won. This was no longer just about a tree. This was about potential fraud and self-dealing. Carol's petty tyranny was propped up by financial malfeasance. I saved the spreadsheet. I didn't know if I would need to use it, but it was another weapon in the arsenal. The walls were closing in on her, and she still had no idea. Her final, desperate escalation came late that afternoon. A courier delivered a large envelope to my door. It was from the HOA's law firm. Inside was a formal notice. It informed me that I had been fined $5,000 for failure to maintain property in accordance with community standards, the tree, and an additional $1,000 for belligerent and uncooperative conduct toward a board member. It further stated that a lien had been placed on my property for the total amount of $6,000, plus legal fees. Attached was a copy of a letter that had been mailed to every single resident in the neighborhood, detailing my violations and anti-community behavior, and warning them that the HOA would take any and all action necessary to protect the aesthetic integrity and property values of Chestnut Lane. It was a public shaming. It was a massive, legally baseless financial attack designed to crush me into submission. It was a declaration of total war, and it was the single stupidest thing she could have possibly done. She had her lawyers put her threats in writing. She had created an official, documented record of her own illegal actions. The lien was fraudulent, filed without a court judgment. The fines were baseless, citing rules that didn't exist or had been voted down. The letter to the community was libelous. I carefully placed the entire package into the oak file. It was almost full now. It was heavy with the weight of her mistakes. I then picked up the phone and made my second call. This time, it was to a lawyer. "Frank," I said, "it's Arthur Penhaligon. I think it's time we had a chat. I have a file for you. It's quite comprehensive." The final confrontation was set for the following week. After receiving the letter from Carol's lawyers, my attorney, Frank, had responded with a blistering cease and desist letter that also demanded an emergency open session HOA meeting to address the fraudulent, lien, and libelous statements. Frank was the legal equivalent of a tactical nuke. He was semi-retired, expensive, and took very few cases, but when he did not lose. Carol's lawyers, likely a small-time firm that handled boilerplate HOA work, must have realized they had stepped on a landmine. They agreed to the meeting immediately. The setting was the clubhouse, a small, sterile room with a kitchenette and a dozen folding tables. It smelled faintly of stale coffee, an industrial cleaner. By the time I arrived with Frank, the room was already packed. Carol had rallied her supporters. They sat in the front rows, a phalanx of grim-faced loyalists. Mark and Steve, the two rubber-stamp board members, sat at the head table on either side of an empty chair reserved for Carol. Brenda, the treasurer, sat at the far end, looking pale and clutching a folder of her own. The back of the room was filled with other residents. Mr. Henderson was there, along with a dozen other faces I recognized, their expressions a mixture of fear and defiant hope. They were the silent majority who had suffered under Carol's rule, now gathered to see if the Titan might finally fall. Carol made her entrance a few minutes late. a tactic designed to build anticipation. She wore a severe black pantsuit, her hair pulled back tightly. She carried a leather-bound portfolio and walked to the head table with an air of unshakable confidence. She was here to perform her greatest role, the benevolent leader, beset by a rogue element fighting for the good of all. She began the meeting by banging a small gavel. "This special session of the Chestnut Lane Homeowners Association is now in order," she announced, her voice resonating with false gravity. "The purpose of this meeting is to address the recent unfortunate dispute with the resident at 14 Chestnut Lane, Mr. Arthur Penhaligon." She then launched into a prepared speech. It was a masterclass in performative victimhood. She spoke of her dedication to the community, her sleepless nights worrying about property values. She painted me as an unstable, angry, old man, a recluse who refused to cooperate for the common good. She claimed the oak tree was a clear and present danger, citing phantom complaints from non-existent neighbors about falling branches. She held up a photo of the tree, gesturing to it as if it were a monster. "We tried to reason with him," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "We offered to pay. We sent polite notices. But we were met with nothing but hostility and threats. The board was left with no choice but to act decisively, to protect our community. The fines and the lien were a last resort, a necessary step to show that our covenants are not mere suggestions. They are the law of this community." Tears welled in her eyes. It was a 5-star performance. Her supporters murmured in sympathy. A few of them glared at me. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting on top of the oak file, which sat on the table in front of me. Frank, beside me, simply watched her, a faint, predatory smile on his face. When she finished, there was a smattering of applause from the front rows. Carol looked directly at me, a look of pure triumph on her face. She thought she had won the jury. "Thank you, Mr. Peterson," Frank said, rising slowly. His voice was a low, calm baritone that cut through the room's emotional atmosphere like a knife. "A very moving performance. Now, if we may, let's turn from fiction to fact." Frank had brought a small projector. He set it up and aimed it at the blank wall behind the board members. "Mr. Penhaligon has asked me to present some documents to the community so that everyone can have a clear, fact-based understanding of this situation." He turned to me. I opened the oak file. The methodical revelation began. "First," Frank said as I handed him the first document. He placed it on the projector. "This is the official certified plat map for Mr. Penhaligon's property, filed with the county. As you can all see," he said using a laser pointer, "the property line is here, the oak tree is here, 22 feet inside his property. The HOA's claimed access easement does not exist. The only easement is for utilities here. Mr. Peterson's entire premise for being on the property is, as a matter of legal fact, false." A murmur went through the room. Carol's expression tightened. "The bylaws give us authority," she began. "We'll get to the bylaws," Frank said, cutting her off smoothly. He took the next document from me. "Second, this is a copy of a certified letter sent by Mr. Penhaligon to the board over a month ago, explicitly stating these facts. And this," he added, placing the small green card on the projector, "is the return receipt, proving delivery, signed by Mr. Carol Peterson herself. This demonstrates that the board, and Mr. Peterson specifically, were fully aware they had no legal right to enter the property, long before they hired a crew to do so." The murmur grew louder. People were leaning forward now. Carol's supporters looked less certain. "Third," Frank continued, his rhythm deliberate and damning, "this is a copy of the report from the sheriff's department, filed after Mr. Peterson called them to harass Mr. Penhaligon. It notes, and I quote, advised Mr. Peterson that this is a civil matter, and that she and any agents of the HOA should be advised to stay off Mr. Penhaligon's property. So now we have the board, knowingly, acting in direct contradiction to advice from law enforcement." Carol was no longer looking triumphant. She was staring at the projected image of the police report, her knuckles white where she gripped her leather portfolio. "Now, about those bylaws," Frank said, a sharp edge to his voice. He looked toward the back of the room. Mr. Henderson, would you care to comment? George Henderson stood up. He was visibly nervous, but he spoke clearly. I was the HOA secretary 3 years ago. Carol proposed an amendment to give the board power over trees on private property. We voted it down. It is not in the bylaws because it was rejected. Frank placed the meeting minutes George had given me on the projector, and here are the minutes from that meeting, signed by Mr. Henderson, confirming his testimony. It seems, Mr. Peterson, that you are enforcing a rule that you know for a fact does not exist. The room was silent now. Even Carol's cronies, Mark and Steve, were looking at her with confusion. The foundation of her authority was crumbling, brick by brick, and then came the collapse. But that is not the most serious issue here, Frank said, his voice dropping. I handed him the final heavy piece of cardstock. You see, this isn't just any tree. He placed the heritage tree certificate on the projector. The official state seal was at the top. The elegant script was clear for all to see. This is a certificate from the state of our state heritage tree registry. Mr. Penhaligon's oak is a protected landmark. It has been for almost 40 years. Attempting to remove it without a state permit is not an HOA violation. It is a criminal offense under State Environmental Code 3A, Section 402. It carries a $10,000 fine and potential jail time. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. He then placed the video still on the projector, the image of Carol, arms crossed, directing the destruction. And this is a photograph of Mr. Carol Peterson, supervising the commission of that crime. That was the moment. That was the turning point. The mask did not just slip, it shattered. The confident, commanding HOA president vanished, replaced by a woman in a black pantsuit whose face had gone completely, terrifyingly blank. Her eyes were fixed on the state certificate on the wall, her mouth slightly open. It was the look of a chess player who has just realized they fell for a trap 10 moves ago and are now in inescapable checkmate. She had no idea. She truly had no idea. Frank wasn't finished. The fraudulent lien she filed will be summarily dismissed, and Mr. Peterson and any board members who voted for it can be held personally liable for Mr. Penhaligon's legal fees and damages for slander of title. The libelous letter she sent to all of you exposes the HOA and her personally to a significant defamation lawsuit. And Brenda, he said, turning to the treasurer, I believe you have something to add about the HOA's finances. Brenda stood up, her hands trembling, but her voice firm. I conducted an audit. The landscaping company we've been paying is owned by Carol's brother-in-law. We've overpaid them by $40,000 in the last 2 years. The gazebo project had a $30,000 cost overrun that was paid to a contractor who was simultaneously renovating Carol's kitchen. The room erupted. The spell was not just broken, it was stomped into dust. The cries of thief and resign came not just from the back rows, but from the front. Her own supporters were turning on her, their faces masks of betrayal. Carol just sat there, motionless, staring at the wall. She had built her kingdom on a foundation of lies, and now, under the harsh, unforgiving light of a simple projector, it had all turned to sand. I felt no triumph, only a deep, weary sense of order being at long last restored. The file was closed. The aftermath was swift and decisive. The meeting ended with a unanimous vote of no confidence in Carol Peterson. An emergency recall election was scheduled, and she was removed from the presidency and the board within a week. Mr. Henderson, to his own surprise, was elected as the new president, with Brenda as his vice president. They were good people, thrust into leadership by a crisis, but determined to set things right. The legal and financial consequences for Carol were severe. The fraudulent lien was, as Frank predicted, thrown out. A judge ordered her to personally pay for all of my legal fees, which, thanks to Frank's hourly rate, were substantial. The new board, after a forensic audit, confirmed Brenda's findings, sued her for the misallocated funds. She was forced to sell her large colonial on the corner to pay the judgments against her. Her brother-in-law's landscaping company lost its contract and was investigated for fraud. But the most satisfying verdict came from the state. Armed with my video, the certified plat map, the heritage tree certificate, and the police report, the state's attorney general's office charged Carol Peterson with the willful destruction of protected state property. She pleaded down from the criminal charge to a civil one, but the fine was the maximum allowed. $10,000. The public record of the judgment was a permanent stain on her name. On paper, where it mattered, she was no longer a community leader. She was a convicted offender. The community itself began to heal. The first act of the new board was to rescind every fine Carol had issued over the last 3 years. Checks were mailed out, refunding money for non-compliant mailboxes, oversized lawn gnomes, and misplaced basketball hoops. The oppressive book of unwritten rules was ceremonially shredded at the next community barbecue. People started talking to each other again, not in whispers but in the open. The fear was gone. My own life returned to its quiet rhythm, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was not the silence of solitude, but the silence of peace. Neighbors would stop by now, not with fear, but with a plate of cookies, or an offer to help with yard work. I hosted a small get-together in my backyard, and people gathered under the branches of the wounded oak, speaking of it with a newfound reverence. It was their tree now, too, a symbol of their liberation. I hired the state's best arborist to care for the oak. He was a friend from my old office. He assessed the damage, which was severe, but not fatal. She was about an hour's way from killing it, Arthur, he told me, shaking his head. Another few inches and she would have girdled it completely. He installed steel cables high in the canopy to support the weight on the weakened side, and prescribed a regimen of deep root feeding and careful monitoring. The tree would bear the scar for the rest of its life, a deep, pale crescent in its ancient bark. But it would live. About 6 months after the meeting, I was out in the yard on a cool autumn morning, raking leaves. A moving van was parked in front of Carol's old house. A new family, young, with small children, was moving in. I watched as Carol's car, a much smaller and less expensive model, pulled out of the driveway for the last time. She did not look in my direction. She just drove away, a diminished figure disappearing down the street she once ruled. I felt no pity, but also no malice. She was simply a data point in a closed file. I finished my raking and went to the nursery. I bought a sapling, a small bur oak, grown from an acorn of a registered heritage tree. I planted it on the other side of my yard, in a spot with full sun. It was small and spindly, barely a whip of a tree. It would be 100 years before it reached the majesty of its wounded parent. I would not be there to see it, but planting it felt like an affirmation. It was an act of faith in the future, a testament to the idea that things of value, things with deep roots, will endure, while the performative tyrants of the world are eventually, inevitably, washed away by the slow, patient tide of truth. I sometimes walk by the old oak and run my hand over the scar. It's smoother now, the edges softened by time and healing bark. It serves as a tangible reminder, a reminder that peace is not a passive state. Sometimes it must be protected. It reminds me that rules and laws are not just ink on paper. They are the framework that protects the quiet and the patient from the loud and the aggressive. They are the soil in which a community can grow. My life is quiet again, but it's a good quiet. The folder, the oak file, sits on a shelf in my office. I don't need to open it, everything in it has been settled. But I keep it. I keep the receipts. Because on paper the story is clear. On paper the truth is permanent. And under the shade of my magnificent, wounded, surviving old oak, I am finally at peace. The order I craved had been disturbed, but through methodical process and a refusal to be intimidated, it had been restored, stronger and more resilient than before. Justice, I've found, is often not a thunderclap, but the quiet, satisfying click of a folder being closed on a matter that is well and truly finished.